Acapulco, Mexico. This is Anarchast.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. I have a great guest coming on, an incredibly smart man who's written, I don't even know how many books. He's Peter Boetke. He's the University Professor of Economics and Philosophy at George Mason University. He was the former F.A. Hayek Fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, former Assistant Professor of Economics at NYU, and I talked about all the books he's written. I'll just name a few. There's Living Economics, so many, institutional economics, so many, I don't even know how many that he's written. And great to have him on, and actually I got contacted with him. I guess he's associated somewhat with Edward Peter Stringham, which was a past Anarchast guest, two-time Anarchast guest. And we got into contact with Peter, and he was mentioning how he wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what he calls this analytical anarchism, which he says is juxtaposed with the normative anarchism one finds in writers such as Rothbard or Hoppe. So very interesting. This could be very very difficult to follow for people who aren't really into all these things, sort of a conversation to some extent, because he's very technical on things like Austrian economics and his thoughts on things like anarchy, but we're going to try to get into all those. So Peter, thanks for coming on, but the first question I do have to make sure is, and ask you, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, first I want to thank you for having me on, and I will try to give good examples that could spread along people that have a variety of interests. Like a lot of intellectuals that get attracted to these kind of ideas, it starts with a professor. I went to a small, tiny college in Western Pennsylvania named Grove City College, and there was a student of Ludwig von Mises who was the main professor there named Hans Sennholz, and he introduced me to the ideas of classical liberalism in the Austrian School of Economics. And when you're a young kid and you get introduced to those things, you sometimes look to push the envelope of what your professor was, teaching you. And so then from there, I very much went into reading Murray Rothbard and then David Friedman and Walter Block and all of those sort of characters. And they had a big influence on me in the way that I thought about things. So that sort of led me to then wanting to delve deeper into these ideas as a professional economist. And so I was tied up in my interest in these questions was tied up also with my interest in economics in general.
That's great, yeah, and you've done so much work. I know you've written a lot and talked a lot about things like socialism and things like that. I'm curious, as a person who follows the markets myself, what you think of the current state of economic affairs as far as how things are going in the world today with all these central bankers out of control. What's your general thoughts on what's going on in the economy right now?
There's, ever since the global financial crisis, we have taken a lot of what I would consider wrong turns in public policy that I think the true costs of have not yet revealed themselves. Part of which is, for example, in the United States, while at the same time the Fed has been doing a lot of very aggressive behaviors, which I think are very costly, the consequences of those haven't quite revealed themselves yet, because they've also been paying interest on reserves, and so the banks are holding a lot of these excess reserves on in their vaults rather than lending out yet. And so the idea of the money spreading through the economy hasn't yet quite happened yet, with the kind of effect and distortions that creates. But, I've lost a bet to a good friend of mine, because I said to him, we'd made a bet in the beginning of the Obama administration that by the end of Obama's time in office, the United States would have double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment, and I'm losing that bet. And there's two ways to respond to that, maybe three ways. One way is to talk about how the government has changed the way we measure these things.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. I don't think he lost the bet.
Yeah.
I think he set it up for Hung. If you're going to use government numbers, yeah, you're going to lose that bet.
And so I think that's an important caveat. I also think that some people might, think that the negative consequences of today policies are not going to show themselves for another, so many years, right? And so we don't discount as quickly as our models might want us to think that they do. And because there's a long and variable lag between the introduction of policies and the behavior. And then the third one is that all these ideas about free market ideas and everything are all wet and we should reject them, and I reject that hypothesis. So, and I think I have good scientific reasons. I wanted to go back just very briefly to your original question, because I gave you my intellectual response, but I also have a visceral response about, these issues. So I was educated in the late 1970s, early 1980s in college, and then in graduate school in the early 1980s. And so if you go back to that time, first, I was in high school and then the beginning of college when we were suffering from the stagflation of the 70s and the consequences of all of that. But we also had the hostage crisis in the Middle East. And at that time, we were still registering for the draft, right? And so mindless 17-year-old that I can remember going to the draft, and there was a kid chained to the mailbox with a Ramones T-shirt, protesting that he was being forced into basically military service, or at least the draft. And I didn't think about it at the time, but as I started to get a little older and started thinking about these things, I sort of had this visceral reaction against the kind of government having that kind of control over our lives, and also the consequences of military adventurism abroad. And so that became a big part. And then, to be completely blunt, in one of my first jobs, I worked digging pools, and when I quit that job, I went to get paid, and the guy, normally they would give me a paycheck, and withholding was taken out of the paycheck, so I just got paid what I got paid, and I didn't think about it. But this time, the guy gave me the money in cash. And then what he did was he yanked it out of my hand. He said, "Oh, I forgot to take withholding out." And then I saw, in a very basic way, him taking the money out, and I'm like, who the hell's taking my money from me? And so there was the gas lines, and then there was this money grabbing, and I got to learn to identify that with the government, so I had this visceral reaction against the government. And so you combine that with then my intellectual knowledge about why the government was screwing things up, and the rest is history, as you might say, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's a big part of why they actually did the withholding tax come straight off your check. Because if people more saw that, actually saw it come into their bank account and then leave their bank account, or as you even saw it in actual cash, it would actually have a different sort of response to it.
Coors got in trouble because he used to do that. Right, so they would get on Friday, the workers would get paid in one window, and then they had to stand in another window and do it, and the federal government stopped them from doing that. So that that story and everything is a very, I think, very sort of illuminating about we don't even realize how much government is controlling our lives. I'll give you another visceral story. When I first traveled to Europe, I was shocked. This is in the late 80s. Shocked by, in Germany, how they made the stand in line security measures and all these things like that. And so I remember thinking to myself, man, this could never happen in America. And then after 9/11, it happened without even a whimper of complaint, And I'm like, really? This is like because I remember thinking how we would never allow ourselves to be herded like, cattle like that. But yet we do it, and we do it, very willingly. And I think that raises a lot of issues about the willingness of people to bear the burden of real freedom and want to be free. And I think a lot of people actually don't want to be free, and that's an issue that we have to deal with.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that they can't not be free, but we still can. Unfortunately, they rope us into the whole thing. And of course, in that Star Wars movie, there was that saying, so this is how freedom ends, to thunderous applause. And that's sort of generally what you were talking about there. It's amazing how people can be so easily couched into giving up their freedom in exchange for security. And I think it was Benjamin Franklin or someone who once said that you can have one or the other, but you can't have both, and that sort of thing.
My very close colleague, Chris Coyne, who the reason why Ed Stringham, my relationship with Ed Stringham, I should explain, is Ed was one of my former PhD students. And so I have a lot of my former PhD students have gone on and done a lot of research in these areas that would be of interest to your listeners, like Ed's book, Private Governance, but also Ben Powell's book on Out of Poverty, and David Skarbek's book on the the way in which prison gangs are organized, and then Pete Leeson wrote a book called The Invisible Hook, which is on pirate organization, and Chris Coyne writes a lot on the failures of military intervention, but his next book is right on the lines that you were just talking about, and it's on how foreign interventions reduce our domestic liberties. So he shows how, like, U.S. foreign interventionist efforts end up by coming back on the U.S. domestically and restricting our individual liberties there. And so, Randolph Bourne had an old, line, which is, the war is the health of the state. And, all, right-thinking people of anarchist persuasion understand that, and they understand that the militarization of the economy and of the nation state are things to be resisted as strongly as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know why we kind of have to tell people war is bad. I just, it's obviously bad, but for some reason, some people just think, oh, we need war. It's like, what are you talking about? It's crazy.
We need, we need security or something without, so it's a tough question. But it's not a tough question. It's a tough question about why we have to persuade people about this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and just even going back to when you realized what was going on a little bit when they took away your cash from your first job there. Yeah. I think a lot of the communist people in general, and I've noticed this, a lot of people who become anarchists or anarcho-capitalists, they've generally, a lot of them are entrepreneurs, and they see all the government horribleness that you have to go through just to have a decent business. And I think because a lot of communists, they don't work. Most of them live off their parents, or they live off government handouts. They don't even get a paycheck to have that money taken away from. But I think if everyone kind of saw that, or actually worked for something, had it taken away, they'd quickly definitely become much smaller government minded, that's for sure.
It's interesting. I mean, I have a son who's 28 and he's a musician. And so he travels around the United States. He's played, music from South by Southwest to the Kennedy Center and Washington, D.C. to, Buffalo, New York, all the way down to Nashville, Tennessee. And he plays alternative music, and he's all part of this sort of millennial generation thing. He's very libertarian in his leanings, and I've been wanting to try to get him to work on a project in which the DIY culture of the millennials should actually be radical libertarian, not Bernie Sanders, kind of weak form socialism. And why is it that they don't understand that point? Because the very reasons why they want to have the DIY culture is not because of the power structures of capitalism, but because of the meddlesome interference of the government in their lives, and including the war on drugs and the sort of problem with the local militarization of police as a consequence of the war on drugs, and then the discriminatory power of the police on minorities and all of these. So this generation who is outraged should in fact be very libertarian, and the fact that they come out in droves for Bernie Sanders, this is a messaging mission failure on the part of, I think, of radical libertarians to reach this. And I think we need to address this DIY culture and not make it be that they're dependent on government handouts, but in fact that they should be embracing completely the sort of true meaning of DIY. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think we do have an opportunity. I think so many libertarians came out of what happened with Ron Paul. So you saw a lot of people who were probably more conservative leaning, but they got into Ron Paul. And then when they saw what happened to him, they said, okay, this whole system, forget about this system. And then I think we saw that just recently with Bernie Sanders. You saw all these young people, they all got all about Bernie. Hey, he's going to fight the system. He's going to make sure it's fair for everybody, which, all sounds good, but he actually really wasn't. But, there's that saying, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you're crazy or whatever. If you're not a conservative by the time you're 30, and then if you're not a libertarian by the time you're 40, once you've gone through it all and figured out how it all works, right? And but thanks to the internet, we have a great opportunity to get to these younger people now, and I see it happening. I also see if you just think about it, the younger people, these millennial generation, they were born in the U.S. with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt already that they apparently owe just for being born in the U.S. Of all the generations who should be kind of realizing this is not good, and not to mention the economy is not great because of all the government regulations, all the taxation, so they can barely even get jobs. That's what the whole minimum wage thing is all about, because people can barely survive anymore because of how bad it's getting, how much inflation there's been, how much the economy's been destroyed. So these should be the prime people to get into libertarianism. And I've actually seen it a bit, Peter. The Students for Liberty is a massively growing movement. And when you meet these kids, it's amazing because, of course, unlike us, I don't want to say you exactly, but I'm like 45 right now. I'm getting a little older. I definitely feel the energy draining a little bit. I can't wake up at 8 in the morning and go till midnight just full of energy fighting the system. I got about 6 hours in me and then it starts to slow down. But they're full of that energy. So if we can get this information to them, and like you said, if you could put out even more great work that we can build off of, because as you pointed out, you kind of gotten into this a little bit through people like Walter Block, who was writing these things before. So we all build off of the past people's work to build towards something that we can all really use.
On the Students for Liberty, they do a fantastic job. And Jeff Tucker, who is now at the Foundation for Economic Education, does a fantastic job presenting the sort of positive side of the kind of anarcho-capitalist position. So a lot of people, including myself, they grow up and they have this visceral reaction against the state, and so a lot of our rhetoric is about what's wrong with the state, and so we, kind of hate the state kind of position, and I'm not saying we shouldn't hate the state, as I stressed already about war and the militarization and discrimination of the police state and whatnot, but it's also the case that the vision of anarcho-capitalism is also a rather beautiful vision about how it is that individuals can interact with each other in a true free society and live in communities that are not encumbered by meddlesome bureaucrats and all of this. And Jeff does a really good job of stressing that, I think. So I think your audience should look up Jeff Tucker, and if they haven't already, and look at the kind of positive spin that he's putting on things with these ideas. I think it's very valuable.
Go ahead.
The work, I was just going to say, I don't know how much you want to get into this, but the work of like Stringham and Powell and Coyne and Leeson and Scarbeck, they are part of this project of what I call analytical anarchism. And the reason why we focus on that is because we're trying to explain the mechanisms about how a free society would operate. Sometimes we do it in even the most unlikely of circumstances. So if you think about the pirates or the prison gangs, these are in situations where people have very, very high time preferences. You would expect them to want to cheat like all the time, but yet somehow you develop these codes of honor among thieves, right? And it tells you a lot about how even in those worlds you can get cooperation without command, without central third-party enforcer. People can, and that sort of then tests how you can see this happen in more desirable environments. But like say, if you look at someone like Stringham, what he did was he explained financial markets, for example, and how financial markets evolved without necessarily the state being the enforcer of contracts. And a lot of people think you can't get complicated financial contracts unless you have a third-party enforcer. And Ed shows that that's not true historically and whatnot. And so, all of these, examples, and an earlier style of work that was done like this was Bruce Benson's book, The Enterprise of Law, which tried to explain how law evolved without a central state to govern, for example, in the merchant law, how it is that there was law, but not necessarily government-made law that governed transactions so that individuals could engage in large-scale investments, large-scale trading, and experience the benefits of great wealth and wealth creation without necessarily a state having to be the thing that causes that. And a lot of people in their heads, they think that unless you have a state to enforce contracts, then you're going to have only truncated economic benefits. So that's like, there's an anarchist thinker named James Scott, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Art of Not Being Governed. But the people that he talks about in that are like primitive societies, that stay outside of the realm of the state. So they couldn't enjoy the view like you're enjoying, right there. And
I'm pretty sure this view was here before government, though.
Yes. And what we're trying to, sort of examine is what are the mechanisms by which we can have both the lack or absence of government, but yet also the creation of tremendous wealth. And so that's what we're trying to do, which is different from the normative project, which is to highlight the violence that government does to our rights. And so we draw a line in the sand and we say, if government does this, it's violating our basic human rights. Not saying that I disagree with that position, but that's not the research focus of our group. Research focus of our group is more or less on the empirical examination of the mechanisms that allow cooperation, or as Ed puts it in his book with his title called Private Governance, how you can actually have private governance of very complex social relationships and the extensive form of the division of labor without a state. And I think that invites a tremendous amount of intellectual excitement and curiosity about how you can see things like that, as opposed to, just viewing that we were just going to be examining the normative assessment of what governments are doing to our rights.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm glad you guys continue to do research on that. We can use more examples and more insights into those things. One thing I've definitely noticed in the last 10 years, or last 5 years for sure, is how things like cryptocurrencies and all of these sort of things are really just changing the game, because before cryptocurrencies, it was quite hard to do a lot of these, what they call smart contracts. Yeah. And now there's people working on those things like crazy. So in some ways, they're creating sort of a environment or a system or a technology that essentially just makes the state obsolete in almost every way.
Yeah, so that's a great point. I mean, we have a former student of ours is now a professor as well. His name is Will Luther. And if you go online and type in Bitcoin and Will Luther, it's Luther. He has written kind of the definitive overview in the academic literature on Bitcoin. And this is so, if you go back and do a little history here, Peter Thiel, when he originally came up with PayPal, he thought he was going to do an earlier version, right, of Bitcoin, which was he was trying to figure out a way to have an alternative currency to state currencies, but it ended up by becoming just a payment mechanism, right? So that was just the technology at the time. So now with the blockchain technology, right, now we're able to get around the system in a way, and whether or not that can be a full-blown alternative, which I'm not sure it's quite there yet, but at least it's showing the way that you can do it. And so the next stage of evolution is going to be even more fascinating. And this ties in, by the way, to your entrepreneurship point before, is because, I'm talking mainly about like kind of the academic ease of all this stuff, because that's what I do. But the reality is that social change really happens by people that are like not studying social change, but actually doing it. And that's going to be your entrepreneurs. And so you're going to see these kind of innovations in Bitcoin or whatever the next generation of cryptocurrencies are going to be. And they're going to continue to be outpace the government regulators. And we're going to find ways around this system. And then, you know, what we're trying to do is study. This goes back to the analytical anarchism point, is to study how those mechanisms that have been successful or those mechanisms that are vulnerable to state capture again, right? So you can start out with a good thing and then the state takes over. So someone that probably your listeners have never heard of is a man named Richard Cornell, fantastic thinker. He wrote a book called Reclaiming America, and then in the 60s, and then in the 70s, he wrote a book called Demanaging America. And then in the 80s, he wrote a book called Healing America. And, you know, they had the impact of a cotton ball, right? So but they were really great libertarian manifestos. But what Dick wanted to do in the 60s was to show that you could have a social insurance system without the state. So yes, there's going to be people who suffer from poverty, ignorance, and squalor. And, you know, in a good society, you know, there's going to be some social insurance mechanisms that will arise, but we can have them without a state. This was his idea. And so the claim that he always said is that the conservatives get it wrong because they constantly argue that we have to starve the state of resources, right? As you've heard this. He says, no, we have to starve the state of responsibility. Right? We have to show that civil society can solve the problems that the state claims it has to step in to do. And so we have to be able to show this. Well, he came up with a fantastic student loan program in the 60s. It was before the current student loan program it was so successful, the government took it over. Right? And so that's like, you know, it was vulnerable to this takeover thing. And so we have to think about that too, because, you know, imagine if Bitcoin's successful, government's going to, one, try to, you know, shut it down, or two, try to co-opt it, right? And same thing with the Uberification of the entire economy, right? So we think about Uber, this is a fantastic evolution, because when we think about the normal political economy approach to getting rid of taxi cab medallions, it's almost prohibitive in the fight that we'd have to fight to defeat the vested interest. Instead, you just do an end run around them with Uber. But, you know, now you see, as soon as you do this, same thing with Airbnb, the interests try to find ways to get the government to shut these things down. So we have to take into account that kind of counter strategy as well as the initial entrepreneurial action. But the reality is that's going to come not from academics sitting around studying these things. It's going to come from people that are involved in action figures, you know, that want to try to figure out a way that earn them a living while, you know, getting us around the cumbersome bureaucracy.
Yeah, if there's anything this interview's told me so far is that we need both. We need the academics. We need people like Murray Rothbard and Walter Block and yourself and Edward Stringham and so many others writing all this stuff, putting out this work so that we can sort of form our ideas off of. But we also need the people out there doing the things. I'm more of on the other side. I'm the more out there doing things sort of person. But this has shown me, you've mentioned a number of books I hadn't even heard of before. So it's great to have you on so that I can learn about some of the things that you know about that I did not know about. And talking about Uber, yeah, there's one city in the US now, they've started taxing Uber, and the tax payments that go from Uber are actually paid to the taxi drivers. Like, and just is unbelievable what they will do.
Terrible. And, you know, I mean, this is what, you know, you got to figure out a way to, like, really, you know, the Uberification is the way I like to think about how can we Uberify the entire U.S. economy, you know, and how are people doing that? And we see it, you know, every day, you know, but, you know, to go back to your point, I mean, Murray Rothbard was a towering intellectual figure. In my own education, For a New Liberty was this manifesto that had this huge impact on me. But going back to the difference that I was drawing between the normative theorizing and the sort of applied theorizing that you see in Stringham or whatnot, it's not that one is better than the other. It's that Rothbard basically, when asked, push comes to shove, how would the market provide X since the government's been doing all along? he sort of said, well, we don't know, because that's how the market would evolve. And I understand that. I can't tell you how the next cryptocurrency is going to evolve. If I knew that, I would have already done it. I'd make a whole load of money doing it. But we wanted to examine these mechanisms rather than just the morality of those things. So in some sense, it's a complement to what Rothbard's doing, in that Rothbard sets up the idea that basically all acts between consenting adults should be legal. And we want to show how all acts between consenting adults are actually going to generate the consequences that people view as desirable right out of that. And so it's like that requires that they evolve institutions and other things that make, as I said before, wealth creation and innovation and whatnot constantly coming about. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the exciting things right now, and I've seen this, I've been involved in Bitcoin since 2011. I instantly recognized that it was going to change the game. I called it an evolution in money and banking. But for a number of years, it didn't progress too much. It was just started in 2009. No one knew about it until 2011. But in the last year or two, I'm seeing innovations like an absolutely staggering amount of innovations coming out almost daily. And you brought up the Uberification. There's already a blockchain-based Uber out there called Arcade City. I've already had the founder on the show. He only started in about December. They've already raised a lot of money. They're already expanding around the world. He'll be speaking at our conference in Acapulco. I don't know if you even know about that. It's February.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we actually have. You should come down if you can, Peter. It's amazing. All these sort of people are going to be there. It's going to be about 1,000 anarcho-capitalists. It's the biggest anarcho-capitalist conference in the world. And so he's already started that. I know even in Argentina, they tried to shut down Uber, and then Uber started accepting Bitcoin in Argentina, which got around some of their credit cards that they couldn't use and stuff like that because they were trying to shut them down. So it's sort of like at a really amazing time right now, because we've got a lot of this information that a lot of the scholars and academics have put together over the decades, and now we're starting to see it happen in real life. There's a company called BitNation. I don't know if you know about them. They're trying to essentially take all government services, make them voluntary, and put them all on the blockchain. And they're having a lot of success right now. And then there's a guy who started Liberland, a new country, which is an anarcho-capitalist country in Europe. They're having a lot of success. So it's really interesting times, isn't it?
Yeah, it is fantastic. I mean, I know what I know about cryptocurrencies mainly through, as I mentioned, Will Luther and Larry White, my colleague Larry White and George Selgin. And whatnot. So, but these are just fascinating, and the more that technology allows us to, do these kind of end-to-run arounds, so it's not just the kind of, charter cities kind of idea or the seasteading idea, right? We also see now these kind of, as you mentioned, cryptocurrencies and other kinds of ideas that are getting around the regulations and meddlesome things. I mean, this is what's we've given it a good run. And if you look at something like, The Economist published that book a couple of years ago called The Fourth Revolution, which just looks at like the levels of debt. You mentioned it before, throughout the Western democracies. Basically since 1940, we have been engaged in this orgy of public debt. And there's no really easy way out of this at all. I mean, if you do the calculations in the United States and you take kind of what they call intergenerational accounting seriously, we're talking about 211 to 220 trillion dollars of debt, and that would require, in order to sort of get ourselves back into sanity, slashes in government programs up to 40% and an increase in the marginal tax rates, assuming that people will pay the tax at the increased marginal tax rates. That would put us all in the 80th to 90th percent bracket. And, that's not going to happen, right? There'll be a revolt against that. And so one of the things that you have to look down is that these countries are all going to repudiate, right? I mean, this is in fact or in effect, they're going to end up by repudiating, which predicts inflation and kind of other things. But they're gonna repudiate. So how are you going to protect yourself against this if they try to monetize these debts? Well, these cryptocurrencies give you the way around all of that. You just, the world collapses and you're okay, right? That's the kind of thing. And we got to kind of look at those kind of economies as economists now, like step back, put my academic hat on. It would be silly for us not to look at that and see how that's going to, is unfolding before our eyes. It's kind of like, the Soviet economist, which is how I started my career. You mentioned a little bit about that. But, in 1985, the Soviet economist sitting there staring, oh, the system will continue forever. It doesn't have any weak points or whatever. That's kind of where I think we look at, in some sense, when we're staring at Western democracies at the moment.
Yeah, I talk a lot about that. I write something called the Dollar Vigilante. I call the U.S. now the USSA because it's getting very similar to the old Soviet Union with all these taxes and regulations and government involvement in the economy. And you pointed out the debt. I've done my own calculations, which are quite similar to yours. At least 100 trillion of realistic amount of debt and liabilities, which if you work it out, that's about $250,000 per person in the U.S. So a family of four would have $1 million of government debt and liabilities that they somehow have to pay off. Not going to happen, as you pointed out. I also talk about a coming debt jubilee that I expect to be happening in the next couple of years, and it's going to have all kinds of ramifications. Of course, it's going to be the biggest change in modern history.
So so just to say, so like in traditional things, if you have a repudiation like that, a debt jubilee, what you're doing in some sense is severing the relationship or the trust bond between the citizen and the state. So going back to our earlier conversation, this is why it's important for us to be out there with this millennial generation, explaining to them about the power of libertarian ideas as opposed to socialist ideas. Because when it seems ironic, and to us it seems counterintuitive, that people will find the relationship between the citizen state severed, and then they'll be like, oh, well, the solution is more state. Right. And we're like, what just happened? Like, you see, this is what happens when you do this. But we need to be out there and we need to be talking to people about this so that they understand this a lot better. In the U.S., for example, our current, situation, you asked me about, our current political situation is just a nightmare. I mean, it's like, you picked, Tweedledee and Tweedledum and even more dumb, kind of thing. And so it's, how are we going to get out of this kind of logjam is going to be a very interesting thing if, to look at. Interesting sounds trivial, but, I would love to read what you have to say about the debt jubilee and all of that. I read, Stockman's book, The Great Deformation. And, when you read that book, a lot of people, like establishment economists, like Paul Krugman and everything, took real pot shots. But I never heard him criticize an argument in the book. Like, where it is that Stockman got the facts wrong or his logic is messed up or whatever. But he just keeps on saying he's a crackpot. But they never really detail, like, where it is that he's cranked about, right? And so that's always a telltale that, maybe there's more there than they think. And, when you look through it, it's hard to actually pinpoint where it is that his logic or his empirics go off the rails. And if he's true about that, this is the whole problem of the last 6 decades in the United States, is that we have deformed our economy. And, to take a more extreme point of view, we have had tremendous innovation, tremendous trading increase opportunities, and other kind of things which offset some of that stupidity of government overregulation. Yep. But it doesn't offset it completely. And so that does distort the issues that are involved. So I think it's actually, we are headed in a way like you're talking about towards a kind of a debt crisis. I just published a paper on this called Taming Leviathan, which addresses this issue and the difficulties. So I mean, this is where the world is at the moment.
Yeah, I can't believe anyone listens to Paul Krugman. I mean, of all the people, like, that guy's the biggest idiot ever. Like he said in 1996 or something, or 98, he said by 2004, everyone will find out that the internet had no bigger effect on our lives than the fax machine. And then he called for the tech bubble, and then the tech bubble collapsed, and he said, what we need now is a housing bubble. And he got it, and then it collapsed, and he's like, now we need more. It's just like, stop listening to these people. They're crazy Keynesians, essentially communist people that.
He had, these guys are the problem. It's not a problem. I mean, there's a great line from Bastiat, right, which says that you should never fear a artful criticism, but always fear an inept defense. And so, to some extent, Krugman's not really the person that any of us really should fear about any of these things. He's kind of clever at times from within his own point of view, but he flip-flops and so he's not the trouble. What we need to do is we need to raise the bar constantly among ourselves. This is at the intellectual front, constantly among ourselves to make sure that we can counter these arguments with the best economics that we have available to us. That's what people are trying to do. And the problem with guys like Krugman and others is that they treat academics. This is one of the problems with academics, is that academics can be like a union card. And then once they get the union card, they have access to sharing their opinions about whatever the hell they want to say, and somehow say it with some like thrust of authority, which is not about the issues that they're talking about, right? So it'd be like me, if you said, you're, I've written on the Soviet Union, and so you say, Pete knows about the Soviet Union, and then next thing you know, I'm talking about, industrial organization or labor economics in op-ed pages without ever studying those things. And so it's kind of a weird, thing. So Krugman talks about everything from soup to nuts, and most of it is nutty.
Well, yeah, one of his solutions to get out of the latest crisis we're in, which is caused by his love for central banking, is he had two. He said, one, let's make a coin and make it worth $1 trillion. That was one of his great ideas. His other one was to fake an alien invasion, because then people would build a lot of guns and stuff to fight the aliens, and it would boost the economy. So the guy's clearly insane.
He actually, when earthquakes happened, we make fun of that, like going back to Bastiat, right? That there's, the broken window fallacy in Frederick Bastiat. And Krugman, but before him also Paul Samuelson, made those errors. They would say things like, this earthquake happened, but that's going to lead to a boom in construction, and therefore the economy is going to be booming there. It does raise an interesting issue to us, because what you do see in the aggregate data, not that you should be looking there, but in the aggregate data is an increase in spending, right? And so they view that as a positive. Right. And so that's how they get their view that they do. And so we need to address that kind of, position.
Yeah, and all this stuff's so important. And as you pointed out, to make sure, try to get this information out to as many people as possible before this big crash happens, because you can already see it. They're going to try to blame it on capitalism.
They did in 2009, didn't they?
Oh, yeah.
But it didn't stick the way it did in 1930s. So we have made progress, right? I mean, think about if we were Martians and we went in a time machine, how difficult it was to make an argument for capitalism in 1935, and compare that to where we are today. And we have made progress, but it's a slow progress.
Yeah, mostly because the people who control the central banks and control the governments also own the media. They also own Hollywood. They also own the school system. Essentially is set up so that people never learn what money is. So they've got it just from every aspect. But I agree with you. I think it is. People are waking up to this, and we just got to keep going. Well,
the big thing is that if the kids and young people experience these alternative mechanisms like the cryptocurrencies and the ability to engage in trade that gives them more privacy than otherwise, and they escape around the kind of efforts of the militarization of local police and everything, they experience this alternative non-state interactions much more in a visceral way than earlier generations did. Partly because the state is in a position to be more annoying than it ever was because of technological increases, right? But we also have the ability to get around it. I mean, think about it this way. The state this is an old Peter Thiel idea, right? Peter Thiel's idea is that regulation makes sense when we are dealing with the world of molecules, but not makes sense when we're dealing in the worlds of bits, right? And I think that the way I like to do it, which is less scientific than that, is to say, look, we have a problem in the world. Who's going to be better at solving it? Nimble entrepreneurs or bumbling bureaucrats? I'm going to bet on the nimble entrepreneurs every time, right?
Absolutely. You just look at it. There's so much history and so much evidence of the government never fixes anything. They always make it worse. And the only good things that are really created are by private individuals. So yeah, we've got all the evidence on our side and getting more all the time. We just have to get it out there more. And I think we are. So that's good. So Peter, I just want to pretty much leave it at that, unless there's something else you wanted to get into, if there's something you wanted to mention.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, and I just hope that your listeners follow up by looking at like Ed Stringham's stuff and Ben Powell's work and Peter Leeson's work and Chris Coyne's work and David Scarbeck's work, and there's a whole bunch of other ones. Alex Salter, who's another young man who's doing great work in this tradition, and he works with Ben Powell down at Texas Tech University. As I mentioned, Larry White, my colleague, and here at George Mason, and Will Luther, who's a young economist who works on cryptocurrencies. And there's just a lot of young talent out there. And I think that, the world is changing, and the people who are studying these changes in the world are changing. And there's a shift to the youth movement. And these kids are wonderful thinkers, and there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about the future.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of any of them except for Edward Stringham, who's been on Anarchast twice. He'll be speaking at Anarchapulco coming up in February. So I'm going to definitely check out the other ones you mentioned.
Yeah, no, and Ed, he can tell you all about them too, so push him on that.
Great. All right, so I'd like to thank Peter for coming on. And if you like this video, please like, subscribe, share down below. Get this information out there. That's what we just talked about. That's the whole key to all of this. If we want to have a freer world, we have to just let people know that the freer world is awesome. And if they just start going that direction, we'll have a much better world. And if they don't, we'll have a tyranny like we've never known it. So those are really the stakes, and we got to get this information out there. So please like, subscribe, share down below. And that's it for Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. Peace, love, and anarchy.
From Acapulco, Mexico, this is Anarchast.